I believe that everybody has a story, and I'm fascinated to hear them. So come with me as we take a walk down Fascination Street. Hey guys, if you like what I'm doing, click the Amazon banner at the top of the homepage on FascinationStreetPod.com and do all of your shopping through Amazon. Once you click on it and it takes you to Amazon, you can bookmark it or add it to your favorites and you won't have to go to my site each time. It helps me keep the show going, and again, thanks for listening. Welcome back, Streetwalkers. This episode is with author Stephen Jimenez. Stephen Jimenez spent more than 20 years investigating and researching the murder of Matthew Shepard. Based on this investigative research, Stephen wrote a book called The Book of Matt: Hidden Truths About the Murder of Matthew Shepard. In this episode, we talk about where Stephen grew up and what led him to become a writer, and ultimately what led him to Laramie, Wyoming. Why this case? He didn't start out to write a book. He set out to write a screenplay. But when he got to Laramie, Wyoming, what he found wasn't exactly what he thought he was going to find based on the news and the media that he had seen regarding the story. In this episode, we get into some of the events and details surrounding this hideous crime that most people don't know about because it wasn't widely covered by the news. This is part one. This conversation was too long and detailed and frankly too fascinating to limit it to one episode. So make sure you come back on Thursday for part two. So enjoy, folks. This is part one of my interview with author Stephen Jimenez.
Yeah, talk to me, yeah.
Welcome to Fascination Street Podcast, Stephen Jimenez. How are you doing today?
I'm doing well, Steve. Thank you.
Well, that is glad to hear. First, I just want to say a thank you to you for taking the time out of your super busy and hectic schedule to hang out and chat with us for a little bit. So thank you very much.
Really my pleasure to be here.
Now, Stephen, where were you born and raised? And we'll get to why I'm asking later. But for now, where were you born? Where'd you grow up?
Sure. I was born in Brooklyn, New York, in New York City.
Oh, okay. And so let's assume you were raised there also?
Yes. I lived in Brooklyn until I went away to college when I was, close to 18 years old.
Where did you go to college?
I went to college at Georgetown in Washington, D.C.
And what did you want to be when you grew up?
Well, that's an interesting question. I went to the Georgetown School of Foreign Service. At that point in my life, I was very interested in international relations, in the United Nations, and that area of study. It turned out after I graduated as an undergraduate, I took some time off and changed my mind and decided to go to graduate school in film. At that time, though, while I was an undergraduate, I was still thinking about international relations.
What made you decide to sort of switch gears and pursue a career in the film industry?
Well, I took a year between undergraduate and graduate school, and I was really weighing going to school in journalism or film, and I ultimately decided to go to film school, but I was looking at Columbia University in both areas, and I decided to go to Columbia Film School.
Gotcha. Now, growing up in Brooklyn, was there a lot of people that you grew up with that kind of either wanted to be a journalist or wanted to be in film? Like, did you have a whole group of you that kind of had the same mindset?
No, actually, I grew up in a kind of a blue-collar neighborhood, a lot of Irish working-class people in the Park Slope section of Brooklyn. The area is now known as Windsor Terrace, but it's part of Park Slope. But it was a very blue-collar area, so I wouldn't say that was something among my classmates. There were a lot of us thinking about going into journalism. By the time I got to high school, I, participated in Model United Nations Conference once or twice. And it was really that sort of got me interested in world events. And then from that, subsequently, I decided to move away from international relations and pursue a career in film, initially documentary film, and then, my interest evolved into both documentary filmmaking, television journalism, and also even fiction, film, and TV.
Interesting. So did you end up graduating with a degree in some sort of film-related endeavor?
Actually, I did, and I'll tell you what happened. My undergraduate degree was the Humanities in International Affairs, and that was from Georgetown. And then I went to graduate school in a master's program in film directing. And during my first year at Columbia, I began working. It started as an internship with a producer in New York City. And she, the previous year, had won an Academy Award for a documentary feature film she had that was released theatrically in the United States. And after working for her as sort of an intern / assistant for a year, she offered me a full-time job. And so I took a leave of absence thinking that I would go back to finish my degree. And sort of one thing led to the next, in terms of work possibilities. And I had to ask myself what a master's degree in film directing was going to do for me other than allow me to teach. And just ironically, a number of years later, I got offered a teaching job at New York University where I taught for 10 years, and I didn't have a master's degree. So I never went back to Columbia to finish my master's after I got my first job in the business.
That's hilarious. So you were a teacher at NYU Film School?
Yes, I taught there for 10 years. I was invited there to teach screenwriting in Tisch School of the Arts, the dramatic writing program, which is part of the Institute of Film and Television, but it's a specific program geared toward writing, being both playwriting and screenwriting, and I taught screenwriting.
Oh, very cool. That is a heck of an accomplishment. Tisch is a big deal. So is NYU. So well done, sir.
Thank you. Thanks so much.
I'm sure you're not missing, having crushing debt and student loans to pay for that master's.
No, although I remember I did borrow some money for the first year. At that time, it wasn't that much compared to what young people face today with education costs. I think I borrowed maybe for that first year $5,000, but I can tell you that while teaching at NYU, I really heard a lot about the student woes, and I think going to graduate school now can cost, close to $100,000. It's a very, very expensive endeavor now for young people.
It is very expensive. Now, you mentioned a woman that's she basically, and also not basically, you mentioned a woman who helped you out a lot by giving you a job as from an internship into an actual job. Are you on good terms with that person?
I sure am.
The reason I asked is because you had mentioned that this was a woman and she had won an Academy Award for a film, and I think you said it for a documentary film. Who was she and what was the film?
Yeah, the producer-director, her name is Barbara Koppel, Kopple, and she had the previous year released a film called Harlan County, USA, which dealt with striking coal miners in Appalachia. So she hired me to work with her. She later won a second Academy Award for a film she made called American Dream. But there was a great opportunity there to learn about independent filmmaking. And the first year I worked with her, I did research for, a new project she was working on, but then eventually she gave me an opportunity to write for her. And so it was really, hands-on experience, and no amount of time in the classroom could take the place of that.
Well, that sounds like an amazing opportunity, and I think obviously you chose well by taking her up on that offer. So a shout out to that young lady. That's super cool. Thank you, Miss Koppel. Now, let's fast forward a little bit and let's talk about the year 1998. In 1998, things are different, and also they're the same. There was a lot of Democrat hates Republican, Republican hates Democrat, the guy who's in office, let's impeach that guy. So there was a lot of the same kinds of things that were going on back then, a lot of the same topics as far as gay rights, rights for all races and all classes, sort of the same. I mean, I hate to sound like an asshole, but sort of the same drum that we've been beating for, I don't know, eternity. So it's really funny that, not funny, but it's been, 25 years or so, and we're kind of still fighting almost all of the same battles. Would you agree? I mean...
Yes, I would. I would agree that, we're a deeply divided country right now. And I think certainly back in the late 1990s, there was a similar mood in the country. I think that perhaps there's even more divisiveness now than there was then. I think it's become increasingly hard for people to have conversations and to talk when they have different beliefs. And I think that volatility in America right now is, it's unfortunate. And certainly as someone who's worked in media and as a journalist, I think that we certainly have to stand up as professionals and take our responsibility for the current state of public discourse.
Now, you said that it's hard for people to talk, and I'm going to slightly disagree with you, only to say that people only talk. Like, they don't listen, and I think that's the problem. Nobody wants to listen to what the other person has to say. They just want to talk and explain how they feel and why the way they feel is the right way without listening at all.
Yes, I think you're really right about that. And I would agree that this is a time when people are not listening as well. And when I said that, when I made the remark, I think I was talking about media specifically, since that's the area where I've worked. And I think that one of the things that's happened over the last couple of decades is that opinion has taken the place of reporting in journalism. And even, on the main networks and in many of the main, news organizations in print, there's a tremendous amount of opinion that is being passed off as reporting and news. And that's what I meant. So I wouldn't disagree with what you said.
I'm glad that you brought up, kind of the way the media is currently, I guess, acting. So, and you don't have to answer this if you don't want to, but do you think that journalistic integrity is dead in America in 2019?
Well, I'm always reluctant to make a sweeping statement that basically says, all journalists are behaving irresponsibly, because I think there certainly are pockets and places and individual journalists that are attempting to do good work. But I do think in general, we've seen a decline in the quality of journalism. And in a democracy, I think that's a really unfortunate development, because if people don't have the information they need, the factual, accurate information they need to make informed judgments, then we in a democracy all suffer. And that's something that really concerns me.
I think that is well spoken, and it concerns me as well. I think that it's, back in the olden days, let's say, you'd turn on the nightly news and you'd watch the news and everybody saw the news. But now, if I'm talking to you about a news story, whether you say it or not, what you're thinking in your head is, yeah, but did you hear that on Fox or did you hear it on CNN? And so, I guess I misspoke when I asked if journalistic integrity was dead. I really probably should have said, is our trust in the news something that's lacking?
Well, sure. In that case, I would have to agree with that. I think that there's been growing distrust of journalism and the media, and I think it's a really unfortunate development. And being a journalist and having worked in media, I'm aware that we have a serious public responsibility. And so your comments earlier about, journalistic ethics and the quality of journalism, I think that they're well-founded, because this erosion of trust that has taken place is because there have been too many examples of, the media publishing information as fact. And then we later find out, well, that's really not the way things went down. So there's a reason for this erosion of public trust. And so I guess the question now is, how are we going to deal with this? And how are we going to restore trust in journalism? Because if the public doesn't have access to accurate information, how then can we as citizens be well informed and exercise our rights in a democratic society?
Exactly. And sadly, I think there's only about 11 people asking that question. we talked about the division that's occurring nowadays. I think that both tribes, if you will, are content to just sit where they are and be fed what they're being fed. I don't think there's too much questioning of where this food is coming from. And I think there needs to be a whole lot more of that before any real change is going to happen in that area.
You know, I think what you say is right. I think it's really clear thinking. Let me just say this, you know, part of the way in which our trust has been violated is by the implication coming from corporate media that there really are only two tribes, okay? And this is something that the actual statistics show, that the largest percentage of American voters are independent. They're neither Democrat nor Republican. But that's not a fact that you're going to see on the evening news. Generally, it's just assumed that you're either on the right or the left, you're conservative or liberal, you're Democrat or Republican. And the fact is that there's a large number of Americans, and I would even argue the majority, that are independent and that really want the freedom. And that's, you know, supposedly the society we live in, the freedom to make decisions based on information, based on accurate information. So that's where I find some hope is, you know, in the sector of the country, people that are independent and really do not toe a party line, but really want to gather facts and come to an understanding before deciding on a particular political line they're going to follow.
Again, well said, and I agree 100%. Let's talk about what affected you, probably the biggest thing that happened in 1998 in your life. On October 6, 1998, Matthew Wayne Shepard, a gay American student at the University of Wyoming in Laramie, was beaten, tortured, and left to die near Laramie. Now, I remember all over the news, as far as I can remember, it was immediately they beat this kid and tortured him and killed him because he was gay. This was a bunch of, you know, cowboy rednecks from Wyoming. Of course, this would happen in Wyoming. What do you remember about that particular event, but, you know, from back then?
Sure. Well, I remember being horrified when I first heard the news of the attack on Matthew Shepard in Laramie, Wyoming. And I'm sure I learned of that event in the same way most other Americans did, which is really from news reports. I'm sure that I, you know, at the time saw reports on television. I remember reading the stories in the New York Times. And at the time, there seemed little doubt that this was a crime that was motivated by anti-gay hate. And so, like many other, you know, gay Americans, I followed the case closely and carefully. It was from the time the crime happened in October of 1998 until the trials were completed in early November of 1999. That was just over a year. So during that year, there were many reports, and I continued to follow the case with great interest. And I can tell you that even a year later, when the trials were completed and I read the news reports then, I still held strongly to the idea and the belief that what drove the events of that tragic night in Laramie was really anti-gay hate.
Now, you said that you had a particular interest in this case and you followed it. Why? Why this case? What about this case drew your attention?
You know, it's very interesting. It was something really on a personal and an emotional level. And I followed the case, obviously, from the beginning because it was a horrible murder in that it just seemed that somehow the location, that the way it was described in news stories, a very kind of, you know, barren prairie setting where this young man who was small, had a small frame, he weighed just over 100 pounds. The description, it was even more than tied to a fence. There were descriptions that he had been crucified to the fence and that he was hung in that fashion. I remember seeing an illustration, I believe it was in the Philadelphia Inquirer, that had a picture showing Matthew Shepard hanging kind of, looking like a Jesus figure hanging on a fence. So that was a very powerful graphic image at the time the crime took place. So I followed the case, really asking myself, as I'm sure many others were, will justice be done in this case? That's one reason, just simply the fact it was a horribly violent murder where the motives seemed very clear from what I had gleaned from newspaper reports. At the time of the conclusion of the trials, and again, this would be late October and early November of 1999, I was really moved by a statement that Matthew Shepard's father made in the courtroom. That's Dennis Shepard. And he made a statement, it was almost a statement of helplessness, saying, why wasn't I a better father and friend to my son, and why wasn't I there when he needed me most? And it was really, a statement of a grieving father. And I thought it was a very honest statement. I want to say it was a very personal impression that made me decide initially to go to Laramie, because I just thought what this family has been through, and to see their son die in that kind of fashion, it really stirred me and moved me. So my initial trip to Laramie was just a couple of months after the main perpetrator, Aaron McKinney, shortly after he was convicted and he received 2 life sentences without parole. That was what prompted my decision to go to Laramie. At that time, again, I just assumed that all of the different news stories I had read, the New York Times, the Boston Globe, Time Magazine, Newsweek, that all of the stories I read, which continued to basically say this was an anti-gay hate crime, because that's where I had gotten the information, I made that first trip to Laramie to do research and to look through the court record, but I was going with a strong conviction that the story that I was going to write was the story of an anti-gay hate crime. If I may just give you a little bit of background, I was very interested in the notion of what a hate crime was. I was very curious about it. In fact, I had written a fictional story that had some basis, or I should say was inspired by real events, but I did change those events significantly. And it really dealt with a racially motivated murder, a fictional murder that happened in Philadelphia. So I was very, very interested in the subject of hate crime. And in that fictional work, the story was really about the perception was one thing about the crime. And as the story proceeded, you found out it was something very different. So the subject of hate crime was on my mind. And in fact, in many ways, that fictional story that preceded my work on the Shepard story was really the reverse. It was a case in which a young African-American male, his murder, it was believed that it had to do with drugs. And in fact, you learn over the course of the story that it actually was racially motivated, but it was a complex set of motives having to do with some coworkers he had in a factory, and that he was getting promotions, and, they basically targeted him. There was a feeling of kind of racial animus, but this was a subject that I was very interested in. And so when this murder in Wyoming happened, I was coming to it not only with an interest in the subject, but it was one that I really wanted to explore further because I felt I had more to learn.
Hey, streetwalkers. Well, you're not literally streetwalkers, but now that I've got your attention, I am Stephen O'Reilly, and I have a podcast called The Bar Star Podcast. And since you're listening to the Fascination Street podcast, I think you should check out my show. It's just as interesting without all the famous people, because Steve has connections that I just do not have. But if you dig podcasts about music, working musicians, and other random shit that I decided to talk about, based around music, of course, because that's what I do. I'm a working musician for the past 30 years, then you need to check out the Bar Star Podcast. You can get it wherever you get your podcast on any platform, and make sure you check out barstarpodcast.com. Now back to the one and only Steve Owens and whatever the hell he was talking about.
Now, I've heard you say in other interviews that you initially went to Laramie to do research so that you could write a screenplay about this event. Is that true?
Yes, that's correct. I went to Laramie with the interest in writing a made-for-television film. I had a producer in Los Angeles who had been interested in doing a project with me for a while. And so I contacted him and told him I was going to Laramie. And he more or less said, well, let's talk about what you find there and a way to approach the story. And so that first trip to Laramie, I met the prosecutor in the case, Cal Baruca, who won the convictions of the two perpetrators in the murder case. So I contacted the producer and I said, it's still too early to say, but, the prosecutor has agreed to help educate me, on the case, and maybe he might be a good source. What I told the producer is I said, he really doesn't seem to have an axe to grind or an agenda. At the time, he was a Democrat, and, it turned out he served 4 elected terms in Albany County, Wyoming. But, I started interviewing him and I started going through the documents. And so that was really initially where I began. And it was months into the process when I started to realize that there were facts of which I had been completely unaware. I don't know if you've seen this in other interviews, but the entire case record was under seal by the court for a year. And all of the principals in the case, and that includes trial witnesses, it includes families of the perpetrators, anyone who had any direct knowledge of the case was bound by a gag order not to speak publicly. So here you have a story that, the national media had a great interest in, and many reporters and camera crews descended on Laramie in pursuit of this story. But many of the people that really had hard information were not in a position to talk, nor could journalists actually get, records with factual information from police officers or from the court.
Why would the judge take such an all-encompassing approach, do you think?
Well, I think there were many factors. I think, if you go back not too long before this, the O.J. Simpson case, I think that some of the law enforcement officials involved with this case thought that the whole thing could be turned into a media spectacle very quickly, and I think they were concerned about that. And, it's very different. I mean, the O.J. case took place in Los Angeles, and this was in a relatively small city, university town, Laramie, Wyoming, which had a population of, at that time, probably about 27,000. I believe there were concerns about a mistrial and what kind of information would come out in the media. So that was something that, a judge decided not to allow cameras into the courtroom. And as I say, the records were sealed and witnesses were under a gag order. So I can tell you, even initially, when I began talking to people in Laramie that had knowledge of the case, there were some people who were actually not only skeptical, but even nervous about talking because they thought that there could be some legal repercussions for talking because they believed the gag order was still in place, which it was not at that point. And also the documents that had been under seal were unsealed at that point. And remember, the town was really under siege by the media, and there were many reporters in town, but they didn't have access to that information. By the time I showed up in Laramie, the media thought the story was over, and they had all left. So curiously, no one was really interested in those public documents once they were released or going to interview people after the trials were over.
So initially you went there to write a screenplay about this event, and ultimately, I guess you sort of changed your goal from writing a screenplay to investigating this story. what was it that you came across that sort of flipped that switch in you and made you sort of change what your goal was?
That's a great question, Steve. And, you know, as is often the case when you're doing investigative work or you're doing, you know, serious research, I would say that the decision to make a change, that it was probably multiply determined instead of one thing, although there was a catalytic event. So let me explain. As I began to talk to people, and I did many hours of interviews with the prosecutor, after I left Laramie that first time, I continued to do phone interviews with the prosecutor. He was very generous with his time. And I'll just say, he made it very clear to me that any attempts to sensationalize the case or to do harm to Matthew's family, he wanted nothing to do with that. But I think he came to believe that I was sincere in my interest in the case, and that I was really trying to educate myself. So we did many, many hours of interviews, and out of that process, there were many other people that I decided that I wanted to talk to. And so I did return to Laramie, and I began interviewing other people. And these were people that either knew Matthew Shepard or knew the perpetrators. And gradually, people started to say to me, you know, there's a lot more to this case than meets the eye. And in some instances, they would hint that there were other factors involved, including drugs. But what happened is I was on one of those subsequent visits to Laramie, and I had put together the first draft of the screenplay. And I asked the prosecutor if he would read it and just give me some feedback from a factual standpoint on things I stated if I had misstated anything. And so this was on a weekend day, and he was reading the screenplay, and he had a great collection of newspaper articles that someone in his family had put together on the case. And so I was going through the newspaper articles, and there were some other things. There were some public documents that were there. And, you know, I thought I'd pretty much seen everything that was in that file. And there was a letter that I came across, a handwritten letter. It was 2 pages. And it was written to the prosecutor. And it was, you know, it was anonymous. It was signed at the bottom, sincerely, a concerned citizen. And the letter referred to the fact that Aaron McKinney, the principal perpetrator who was convicted in Matthew's murder, was not straight, that he had been to gay bars. It mentioned another man who lived in Laramie who was also pretty well known to be gay or bisexual, but it suggested that Aaron McKinney had been involved with other males, you know, for some form of payment, including money. And so I read this and I thought, well, I understand, you know, that this is an anonymous letter, so this is not something that I'm going to be able to confirm with the person that wrote it. But I had to pause and say, if what is alleged in this letter is true, it changes the whole public perception of what this case was about. So I made a copy of the letter, and I started to think about what some of the sources that I had interviewed and spoken with in Laramie had been telling me, and what I had just discovered in this letter. So it was at that point that I really said, I can't put a screenplay or be part of making a film until I really understand more about what this case was really about. So that was when the switch got flipped, and I decided to really do more research. I pitched the story to the New York Times Magazine. They commissioned me to write an investigative article on the murder. And by that point, when I went to them, I had contacted the 2 men convicted of the murder, Aaron McKinney and Russell Henderson, and I did that through their respective family members. I did it through Aaron McKinney's father, Bill McKinney, and through Russell Henderson's grandmother, Lucy Thompson. And because I spent time getting to know those family members, they were basically willing to say to Aaron and Russell, this guy seems to be seriously and genuinely interested in the truth of the case. And so that's really how I was able to get those initial interviews with McKinney and Henderson. It was at that point that I went to the New York Times Magazine and I said, this is the first time any journalist has had access to Aaron McKinney and Russell Henderson. And I have been talking to the prosecutor. I've done a number of interviews with him. And it appears that there was more going on with this crime than what was reported. So I was commissioned by the New York Times Magazine to write an investigative article. So that was really very early on in my pursuit of this story as a journalist.
How many people do you think, well, you probably know exactly, but how many people did you interview throughout your investigation for this case?
Well, I know that the number is over 125, and right now it could be 135, it might be 137. And the reason I say that is because I have continued to interview people. Even very recently, I just did an interview, a prison interview. It was last month. And I'm writing a new chapter for the new edition of the Book of Matt, which is coming out in early 2020. So I have continued to talk to sources, and after the hardcover came out, and then after the paperback came out, and the hardcover came out in 2013 and the paperback in 2014, I continued to hear from people. So somehow someone would get my number through someone in Laramie, or I would get an email, or someone would go to the book's Facebook page. And so I began to hear from other people, some of their names I had never heard of before. So when you ask me, I can tell you that when the book was published, at that point, I had already spoken with 125 people, and the number has increased since then.
So that being said, how long have you been working on this case?
A really long time. Too long. I first went to Laramie in February of 2000. So we're talking now over 19 years. And obviously along the way, I've done some other things professionally, and I've worked on some other stories, but no project that, I've ever been involved with has occupied my time and my resources and my energy as much as this one has. And, it's that old saying, if had I known then what I know now, I'm glad I didn't know then what I know now, because had I any inkling that this was going to take up this kind of chunk of my life, I might have made a different decision. That being said, I don't have any regrets. I have returned to Laramie often over the years. I would say now I get there probably at least 2, sometimes 3 or 4 times a year. I've made some lifelong friends there. And, I've participated in some public events there. Last fall was the 20th anniversary, and there was a town forum to discuss the case on the 20th anniversary on the subject of why truth matters. And, it's very interesting. I think I can say with confidence that the majority of people in Laramie who live there now, who were there at the time of the crime in 1998, know that this was not as it was widely reported to be, what the case was about. And so I love the town. It's something that I learned early on when I had the fears that this was sort of the hate crime capital of America. I have not experienced Laramie as being, a homophobic place, certainly not any more homophobic than any other place is. And so, I still have quite a connection to the town. And the story to me of this tragedy, I believe, has grown with importance over time for reasons we were discussing earlier about the current state of journalism. And certainly in the 20 plus years since Matthew Shepard was murdered, the state of journalism has not gotten better. It has been in a state of decline over the last 20 years. So part of the reason I've stuck with it is because I really do believe that truth matters. And to go back to your point about political beliefs, it doesn't serve us. It doesn't serve the body politic in a democracy to form opinions based on our beliefs. We need facts. We need to understand what is factually true and accurate. And so that's one of the reasons I've stayed with this story. We certainly have other examples of important stories, important events in, contemporary American life. One example that comes to me is the motives for going to war in Iraq. That there were, Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction. And that story was widely publicized everywhere. And we later learned, well, in fact, there were no weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. So, my reason for staying with this story is I think it's an important one for the culture. And I just think it behooves us to understand the complexities behind a milestone American crime like this one.
I agree. Now, do you think that you will ever finish investigating?
Well, let me tell you, I have an answer to that question, okay? There's a reason why I have continued to investigate, and it's not simply around Matthew Shepard's murder. In the book I wrote, I touch on a murder that happened in Laramie 1 year before Matthew's, a 15-year-old girl named Daphne Sulk. And there were murders that followed Matthew Shepard's. Russell Henderson's mother, this was just a few months after Matthew Shepard, she was abandoned on a night when it was 20 below zero by the side of the road, allegedly had been raped. And this was on the outskirts of Laramie, and this was in early 1999. And there were also several other murders that followed in Laramie and in Wyoming that a few of them were clearly related to drug trafficking. And so one of the surprise discoveries for me in working on the Shepard case was the role of crystal methamphetamine. And at the time the Shepard murder happened, meth was not something that was being widely discussed in America. And yet it was becoming a really serious problem in certain parts of the country, particularly in the Midwest, but it was also moving westward. There was a big problem in Nebraska, Wyoming, Colorado had a meth problem, Montana had it. But early on, it was Midwestern states like Missouri, Iowa, etc. Well, that meth epidemic that was growing in the mid to late 1990s and into the early 2000s was producing a whole new epidemic of crime, of violent crime. So part of what my education was while I was working on the Shepard murder had to do with crystal meth. And part of the reason I've stayed interested and engaged with this story is because I now understand the Shepard murder in a context of these other violent crimes that happened. And Laramie is a town that really felt the brunt of the meth problem in a significant way because of its location on the interstate and the fact that a substantial amount of drugs were moved across the country on the interstate, often from California. At the time the Shepard murder happened, about 80% of the methamphetamine being consumed in Wyoming was being produced by Mexican cartels. And at the time of the Shepard murder and in the years that immediately followed, Wyoming had the highest per capita rate of meth abuse in the nation. And that's something that continued for many years after the murder. So my interest in the specifics around Matthew Shepard's murder go to some larger issues. And so that has kept me engaged. There are also people that at the time, for whatever reason, whether it was a personal connection to someone that was involved in the case, whether it was a job they had, there are any number of reasons that there were some people that simply did not want to talk about the case at the time. But over time, as more of the truth has come out, more people have been willing to talk. And so obviously, with a case that has had this kind of cultural, social, and political significance, and even historical significance in the country, as someone who has really helped assemble some of the history of this case, I have an interest in seeing that that history is written accurately. Obviously, there have been dramatic presentations, there have been some films, and the story that has been presented, a large part of it has been mythology. And so I'm not saying that there's not a place for mythology and legend, but I think there's also an important place for factual truth and for journalism. And so it's not that I'm on a mission, particularly with the Shepard story, but the meth crisis and the meth epidemic was a big development in this country that affected many, many people. And, often when I'm giving interviews or I'm doing a public presentation, I tell people, probably had the TV show Breaking Bad, had that never been produced, there would probably still be a lot of ignorance about meth and meth crime and what meth will drive people to do. But Breaking Bad sort of shifted the culture on the subject of meth, and meth was something I was looking into before Breaking Bad ever went on the air.
You said that a lot of what we know about the case is based in mythology. What do you mean by that?
Let me give you one very important example. If you go to the original news stories alleged that the two men who were the perpetrators went into a Laramie bar on the night of October 6, 1998, and that they were strangers who had not met Matthew Shepard before. That understanding, that piece of the popular mythology, was that these two guys, these rednecks, as you described them earlier, went into the bar and they saw Matthew Shepard there for the first time, that he looked well-dressed and appeared to be gay, and that they lured him out of the bar to target him for robbery and eventually a fatal beating because he was gay. That is simply not true. Aaron McKinney and Matthew Shepard had been friends, had socialized, they'd partied together, and they knew each other very well before the night of the crime. So the fact that this was an unequivocal hate crime motivated by anti-gay hate or anti-gay animus is simply not true, in the sense that Aaron McKinney and Matthew Shepard knew each other very well. The other perpetrator, I should say the accomplice, Russell Henderson, had never met Matthew Shepard before that night, or what I can tell you is I have uncovered no information from any source that Russell Henderson had met Matthew Shepard before that night. However, I have spoken with and have on the record over a dozen sources who have spoken about the relationship between Aaron McKinney and Matthew Shepard prior to the night of the attack.
I think you said that you had maybe come across some information that would indicate that he might have, at one point or another, engaged in homosexual activity, right?
Yes. Well, I would say, again, if you take me back to the early stage of my investigation, when I told you that I discovered this anonymous letter at the courthouse, that was the very beginning. But again, over time, I was able to get information conclusively regarding Aaron McKinney's sexuality and the fact that Aaron McKinney was a closeted bisexual and that he had had numerous sexual encounters with other males. To give you a couple of examples of that, one of my key law enforcement officers on the case, he told me that it was actually fairly well known. There was an instance where, a police officer came on Aaron McKinney in a kind of lover's lane area in Laramie where Aaron McKinney was in the car with another male. Okay, and so that came from law enforcement. It also came from law enforcement that while Aaron McKinney was in jail awaiting trial, that they had, through surveillance, and I assume it was video at the time, they were aware of encounters that he had at the jail. I got access to an interview that was done with one of Aaron McKinney's cellmates, and I believe the man is now deceased, but his name was Albert Castaneda. And Albert Castaneda was gay, and he had been Aaron McKinney's cellmate for a period, and he said he had no problem whatsoever with Aaron McKinney being homophobic. But in addition to that, there are on-the-record named sources that I, have used in the reporting of people that partied with Aaron McKinney and Matthew Shepard in the same place, including in a limousine where they were engaged in sexual activities. There is a former boyfriend of Matthew Shepard's who knew Matthew quite well, and he also had engaged in a threesome and engaged in sexual activity with McKinney and with Matthew Shepard. I interviewed two former bartenders from a gay bar in Denver. At the time, the bar was called Mr. Bill's, and it has a different name now. But it was a well-known gathering place for male hustlers. And the bartender managers who worked at Mr. Bill's also identified Aaron McKinney as someone who had worked at the bar as a hustler. So we're talking about numerous sources here. So there's nothing speculative anymore on my part as far as whether or not Aaron McKinney was bisexual. Even his girlfriend at the time, has acknowledged that he had asked her to have a threesome with him and another male. So the fact that he, had multiple experiences, bisexual experiences, in my opinion now, this is irrefutable.
All right, folks. I think I'm going to cut it there. That's probably a good length. Make sure you come back on Thursday to catch part 2 of this fascinating interview with author Stephen Jimenez. And in the meantime, if you haven't already, scroll down to the link in the show notes and order The Book of Matt, Hidden Truths About the Murder of Matthew Shepard. It's a wild read, and even though it's dark, the truth is more fascinating than you could possibly imagine. Hey guys, this is Steve Owens from Fascination Street Podcast here with a very important message. I'm awesome. I bet you thought I was going to say something else, but nope. What's important here is that I am awesome. I started this show because I truly believe that everybody has a story, and I'm fascinated to hear those stories. In the short time I've been doing this show, I've interviewed actors, directors, writers, inventors, podcasters, musicians, pro athletes, Olympic athletes, actual war heroes, even a Bond girl and a luthier, whatever the hell that is, and of course, regular people. From people who wanted to be stars but never gave it a real try, to big company CEOs and people who got to meet their favorite president. I love getting to meet and speak with people who have a story to tell. I feel like everyone does, and it's my job to get them to tell it. You never know who my next guest will be. An Academy Award-winning actor, a platinum-selling musician, or your own mother-in-law. But one thing is for certain, you will be fascinated by their story. So come take a walk with me down Fascination Street. You can find Fascination Street Podcast on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Spotify, iHeartRadio, and of course, FascinationStreetPod.com. Opening music is the song Magnolia from the 2014 album Intransigence, used with permission from Douglas Miles Clark. Closing music is Apollo from the 2001 album Into the Known by the band Sapphire. Thanks for hanging out with us and getting to know a little bit about our guest. We'll see you next time on Fascination Street.